Hey, it's Julian here from Whisk. What if HR felt magical instead of mechanical? That's why I want you to meet Harper from Whisk, the world's first AI HR generalist. Harper takes work off her team's plate, resolves up to 80% of HR tasks autonomously, and streamlines your most complex cases at a fraction of the cost. Come find out why Harper was named top HR product of 2025 and see how she helps HR teams get their life back at whisk.com/tincup. That's WISQ.com/tincup.
Job hopping is this awful thing. Why? Because there's this idea that if we hire this person, they're just going to leave. So why would we want to invest in hiring them, bringing them up to speed, training them when they're going to be gone in a year anyway, right? Everyone, when they join an organization, they're going to take a performance hit, this temporary drop in performance when they're kind of entering a new context, they're facing all this uncertainty. We focus so much on learning when you come up to speed in a new company, but when you're leaving an old company, you need to unlearn what you learned about that context, the way that we do things, the way that you influence, the way that you get buy-in, the way you collaborate. I would push organizations to look internally and actually question, are these assumptions that we've been hanging on to actually valid? Do they actually play out? Or would we surprise ourselves and see that maybe we should be more open to people who've moved around?
What is going on, everybody? This is Ryan Leary, and you are listening to the You Should Know podcast. Today, we have Rebecca Kehoe with us from the ILR School at Cornell University. She is a professor of human resource studies and does a ton of amazing research in the area of strategic human resource management. Rebecca, I know I'm going to butcher all of your work if I do this myself. So first off, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here, but give the audience just a brief introduction to yourself and the work that you do.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. So I'm Becca Kehoe, professor of HR studies. I do research on human resource management and more specifically trying to understand how organizations can really manage employees effectively to create value. So my work really tries to find this balance where organizations are helping to create value for employees, but also creating value for employees themselves. So I'm looking for kind of win-win relationships there.
Yeah, so the question is, how did you get into this area of research? What drove you to do this?
Yeah, great question. So actually, years ago, my undergraduate degree was in business, but my business degree had no focus on people. It was all economics, finance, marketing, and I finished. Peers going to Wall Street, roles that I was not interested in, and I kind of said, "What's else? What else is there? There's something else to organizations," and obviously the answer was people, and I wanted to really understand. I understood all of these other drivers of organizational success, and I wanted to understand the role that people played. And that's kind of what led me not just to HR, but to this kind of direction within HR.
Yeah, so we have very different paths. I graduated business as well, but I was at a job fair, actually. And it was the person that I was meeting there. I wasn't getting into recruiting or anything related to this field, but the person that I was supposed to meet at the job fair, this is just where the individual was. It was for my onboarding, and it was for Ryan Holmes, the company Ryan Holmes, and they never showed up. And so I'm sitting at the table and I'm like, okay, what do I do? Like, here I am, whatever you are when you graduate school, 20, 22, something like that. And they no-showed. And so, I was just there to meet the person so that I can literally get my laptop and my paperwork and go on, because I had no reason to be at a job fair. And the table next to me was with Enterprise Rent-A-Car. And so I started talking with the woman, and she could tell, here I am, this like young little whippersnapper, probably clueless looking, right? And she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm supposed to meet this person, and he's not here." And so I started talking with her, and I ended up working at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I left, I worked, and I got into recruiting. And so within, I guess, the first year or so, I did the enterprise thing. But then I ended up in recruiting, and I never got out. And so since 2003 timeframe in that range, yeah, I've been recruiting and studying, researching HR and the way work happens, but totally by mistake. So at least you had a path and you did what you were supposed to do. But so let's talk about some research. You recently had a study that you were working on. Tell us about that and what you found, because I'll prep the audience, and they can probably tell because of the title of this episode, whatever that title ends up being. When you presented this and said, "Hey, let's talk about this," I got excited, and I don't get excited that often when I hear topics. I'm like, "Yeah, we'll talk about this," but this is something I think that recruiters for decades have been trained improperly on and penalized for in their recruiting and hiring practice. So tell us about this study, and we'll kick this thing off.
Yeah, so thanks for that. The study really focuses on how employees' experiences moving from job to job or from organization to organization affects what happens later when they join a new organization and that process of coming up to speed. So the term that we hear most frequently kind of out in the real world, outside of the research world, is job hopping, right? Job hopping is this awful thing. Recruiters, as you said, they want to avoid job hoppers.
Yeah.
Why? Because there's this idea that if we hire this person, they're just going to leave. So why would we want to invest in hiring them, bringing them up to speed, training them when they're going to be gone in a year anyway, right? So there's this really big stigma around job hopping. And in this research, we found, okay, job hoppers may be more likely to leave sooner than other employees, but it turns out there's this kind of silver lining where when job hoppers join a new organization, they come up to speed more quickly, right? So we actually know that everyone, when they join an organization, they're going to take a performance hit, this temporary drop in performance when they're kind of entering a new context, they're facing all this uncertainty, they're learning the new job, meeting new people, figuring out how things work. So they take a drop, a decline. You see a decline in performance. Job hoppers, they don't see so much of a decline, and they bounce back much more quickly. So they come up to speed much more quickly than other employees. And it's not just by accident, right? So this is what we kind of dug into in this research. And what's going on is that, yeah, job hoppers are moving from one organization to another, but there's some really critical learning that's going on in that process. Right. They're bringing that learning with them, and that's providing them an advantage when they join a new organization.
Right. Now, is it because they're wired differently, that they learn differently and then they act differently? Or is this just maybe they've fallen into this, I couldn't hold the job, so I learned and I went and I went and I went, almost like a contractor, for example, and they go job to job because they couldn't hold down a job? Or is that theory out the door at this point, and we're just saying now these people are wired differently, they learn differently, and when they come in, they execute faster with more impact before they then move on to their next opportunity?
Yeah, these are all really great questions, and questions that we weren't directly seeking to address, but we did along the way to kind of check, is this explaining our findings, right? So it turns out no to most of your questions. So if none of these people are wired differently, we controlled for or accounted for likelihood of being a job hopper or factors that might make you more likely to move from one job to another. We accounted for kind of career-long performance differences. So this is an important thing to know. It's not that job hoppers are better performers across organizations and across roles. It's that they come up to speed more quickly. So that's really what we're focused on, that sort of initial period of socialization. We also looked and found they're not more likely to leave after a period of declining performance. So it's not that they're failing at one job and they're just, I guess I have to move somewhere else, right? It's really that when they move, regardless of why they move, it's the experience moving and what they're learning in that process that they're taking with them and bringing to another organization. So what we really dug into is this idea that when we join a new organization, there's so much that we don't know, right? Even if we're doing a really similar job to what we've done before, we've got to figure out this new context. We've got to meet our peers, figure out what are the expectations, what's the culture here, right? Things work differently at different companies. You got to figure out how am I supposed to play with others in this context. job hoppers have an advantage, not because they know the people, not because they know the context any better than anyone else, but they have a better sense of what they don't know and what they need to learn. And that's where they have had a leg up over people who haven't had that experience moving.
So we have to dig into that because I say that all the time. You don't know what you don't know. However, when you get into an opportunity, I feel like there are certain people that excel really well in those situations. I was reading a research piece the other day on why high performers often wait to the last minute to do something, and this was actually specific around college and writing research papers. And so, why does a high performer wait until 2 days before it's due or the day before it's due to write the research paper? And it's not that they're just procrastinating because they're lazy. It's because they process things differently. They're wired differently. They're able to parallel process and do a task for 7 days. But in the back of their mind, they're correlating everything they're doing to what they're going to be doing. And so they're then able to then write this paper and perform better and under pressure, where not everybody can do that. They have to work a month out and do their steps and write their outlines and do all of this stuff. And some of the high performers, as they've classified them anyhow, they don't need to do that. And it's just, that's the way they are. And so when you say they don't know what they don't know, that was how I took that. It's like, are these high performers? Are these just really ultra high level performers that come in? They don't need to know who their colleagues are and learn all. They're going to get that because they're just part of there's just part of their DNA to understand it. And they go in and they do their job and they get it done. And when they're ready, then my next question is going to be, when do they move on? What determines their move?
So that's my next research question. So that I can't answer. But to the point of kind of what's going on in that process, it is actually that they need to learn. They do still need to learn the same things about the context that everyone else does. It's that they do it much more efficiently because they have a better understanding of how to do it, right? So part of this study, we found that this job hopping advantage is greater. So job hoppers are kind of even better off than their peers when they're entering roles that require closer collaboration, when they're kind of forced to engage with people in their new organization. It's that advantage is greater when you're entering a context where the culture is kind of really tight and rigid, where there's there's sort of higher social barriers that you have to overcome. So it's not that they're getting away with not engaging or that they already know better. It's that they're just better able to do it and better able to do it more efficiently because you figure out, okay, I know now that I've been at X number of organizations, I know I can't come in and just start trying to exert influence in the same way that I did at my last job. Right. What I know the first step is figuring out, how do people make decisions around here? How do I get buy-in around here? Are these kind of closed door sort of meetings? Are they water cooler conversations? What is the norm here, the expectation? And I know how to slide into that much more effectively than someone who's in their first or second job who comes in and tries to steamroll based on what they know that they've done from their last experience.
Yeah. I've done that before. Yeah. I've come in before like, I've got this, I know how to do it. And then turns out I didn't know what I was doing, but I was able to make it work. So how does this change? Does it change hiring? One, does it change hiring today? Or do we still have to convince hiring managers and hiring teams and companies that it's okay to hire job hoppers? And I feel like, and you might have some thoughts on this, pre-COVID, and I always use COVID as kind of that benchmark, but pre-COVID, this wasn't even a question. Companies they refused to hire job hoppers, and it was a bottleneck, a big bottleneck in hiring. Post-COVID, I feel like it's okay. It's become slightly more okay for companies to hire these types of people because they're fractional CMOs or fractional, marketers or whoever they are, and it's more accepted. But how does this actually change hiring now moving forward? Are we still in the learning phase for them?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think the first thing I'd say is some of what our research shows is that there are certain contexts where hiring job hoppers makes a whole lot of sense, right? So if you're hiring for a job where it's critical that somebody comes in and hits the ground running, you need them to come up to speed quickly, then a job hopper makes perfect sense, right? Maybe what you're prioritizing isn't how long they're going to stay. It's can they come in and hit the ground running tomorrow? Because that's what I need. That's really critical. The other piece that I think our research sheds light on is the hiring context. So is this a culture is our organizational culture one that's kind of hard to break into? Is this a role that requires really close collaboration with people who are tightly embedded in this culture? Because that's where job hoppers also show that particular advantage in being able to break through. The other thing I'll say is, to the point of the pre and post COVID, I think what you're recognizing is there's this kind of new reality that in some cases, there's not a choice. Like you look at the applicants and they've moved around. And so it's kind of accepting that and maybe seeing a silver lining associated with it.
Yeah, we've had a number of conversations on this, especially closer to, the pandemic, where it was HR became the superheroes and became the people that they actually wanted to be. And I say that in a really loving, endearing way. They became the people they wanted to be in HR, why they took the role. They had to care for people. They had to communicate to people. They had to take hold of issues and actually solve issues. And they were forced out of let's process. And so, yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's changed a lot in hiring, moving forward. And the way we look at people overall in hiring. Is there a difference in skill level between a job hopper? And I feel bad saying job hopper. I feel like it's a bad term, and it's really not. But is there a skill level difference? Did you find any difference in skill level between what you would classify as a job hopper? Maybe we should do that. Let's classify job hopper first. What determines job hopper? Is it 12 months, 24 months? And then is there a real skill difference between what you would define as a job hopper versus someone who's been at a company for 7 or 8 years?
Yeah, good question. So the way that we looked at this, actually, we weren't looking at the amount of time that anyone spent in a particular organization. We were looking at how many times you moved across organizations, right? So
Okay.
regardless of, it could be that you spent 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 5 years, right? That was your pattern. It could be that the pattern was something different across the prior organizations. But what we were interested in was the number of times that you moved. And we actually looked if that mattered, if kind of the compression or this how spread out those moves were mattered, and it didn't. So what it told us is that what job hoppers are bringing is based on that cumulative experience of transitioning between organizations. And then to the question of skill, they're not different in terms of their job skills. The skills that they're likely to differ on are the skills they accumulate in that process of integrating into a new company and transitioning between companies. So those are skills like communication skills, collaboration skills, ability to adapt to a new context. And then another important thing we haven't talked about yet, but this is really critical when we think about any job other than your first job. There's this really important element of unlearning. So we focus so much on learning when you come up to speed in a new company, but when you're leaving an old company, you need to unlearn what you learned about that context, the way that we do things, the way that you influence, the way that you get buy-in, the way you collaborate. There's an unlearning where you shed your beliefs and sort of internalization of the values and priorities from that context in order to open yourself to what's new in the context that you're joining. So another benefit we think that job hoppers have is they're able to unlearn more easily because they recognize that the way that I just did things, even if I internalize that while I was at my last company, I've been at other companies and I know there's not only one way of doing things. I know there's not one best way. It's that I need to fit into the context where I'm currently working because that's what's going to work there. And they're able to adapt and do that because they've seen it time and again.
Right. Yeah, that's actually really, and I haven't really thought of it that way. That's really interesting. So, okay, so this is a little, so two things here. One is, have you, in this study, did you measure impact on job hoppers versus bringing a job hopper in and how quickly they can impact an organization, whether it's revenue, efficiency, productivity, whatever that is, versus someone who's been in an organization for, or someone that you brought into an organization who genuinely has a longer tenure at companies before they move. Did you find anything specific there?
Yeah, so in the particular study, and this will vary across context and everything, but we saw all else equal a difference in it taking, we'll say, typical movers or low moving employees, 5 months to kind of bounce back in terms of their performance, relative to 2 months for higher movers or what we might call job hoppers. So a pretty significant difference there. And these differences were even starker when we looked at contexts like the ones I talked about, where this is a really tight culture, or where you're entering a role that's requiring really close collaboration. And the idea there is, when you're entering a role that requires really close collaboration, you can't avoid integrating into that social context. You can't work in a vacuum in a bubble in your office and do things your own way. You have to figure out, what are the expectations here? How do we do things here? And buy into that to some extent and adapt.
Yeah. Now, did you measure this also in lateral moves from within the same company? So you're moving from, maybe 5 jobs within the same company over a 2-year period versus new companies? Did it
so
take?
We didn't, but I think that there's a really important takeaway here that obviously needs further, like, actual empirical study. But I think there's something that organizations can take from this when they think about moving people internally, right? So if employees are benefiting from moving from one context to another between organizations could take advantage of this as they think about project assignments, stretch assignments, tasks, right? What if we move our employees strategically internally to give them that exposure to different contexts within the organization? When you think about kind of micro transitions, they don't even have to be full job moves. It could be project assignments, new teams, maybe they're job rotations where there might be more temporary, but organizations can help employees to benefit from this kind of learning without necessarily losing them, right? Because they're helping them build that opportunity internally.
Yeah, so years ago, I worked at Connexa. You may know Connexa before they were acquired by IBM, but it was I started there in 2007, and ultimately I left in 2016, and so but I wasn't in the same role. If I went back and looked at my resume and really put it in, I've had at least a dozen, maybe more, roles within the organization. Not all of them were up the ladder. A lot of them were lateral moves, a little money here and there, but lateral moves that kept me there for that long. And they really, looking back on it, younger me got taken advantage of, right? Because I did all this great. Now, I've learned a lot. But I wasn't paid accordingly. At least now I look back and like, okay, I took a dozen different jobs, but I didn't always get a step up in pay. But I did get experience. And so at that time, I was looking, well, it'll help me later on in life. And I never actually used it all, because here I am and we're talking, which is great. It got me somewhere. But the lateral moves, I think, is important. I think that's an important for an organization to understand, because a lot of companies, they'll move employees, they'll do stretch assignments, but I don't actually see them, at least in our conversations, we're not seeing them actually leverage and take advantage of the actual move itself. And then after the employee does, stretch assignment A or B, they kind of go back into their previous role. It was like a borrowed skill set for a month or two, as opposed to, let's continue to move this person, and let's continue. And ultimately end up losing the employee because they're just back into the same old job and they're not doing anything. And so they bounce out of that role. So, all right. So in 2021, I went back and did a little bit of research on you. You did you recorded another podcast on star employees. I know you remember that one, right? Though I listened. I only got to listen to about half of it, but the question that came to mind, it was probably in the first 5 or 10 minutes of it that came to mind. Is there a correlation between what you would consider a star employee and a job hopper? And so now that I know more about your research, it's probably not the right question to ask, but I'm going to ask it because it came to mind. So is there a correlation between what you would define as a star employee versus what you're defining as a job hopper?
Yeah, no, this is actually exactly the right question. So
Right, perfect.
I do a great deal of research on stars, and I'm really interested in them. And we actually looked at exactly that question. And so what we found was no. So we looked at the cumulative like exceptional performers over their careers, and are they more likely to be job hoppers? And the answer is no, which is interesting in that we know that stars have more opportunities than other employees because they've got visibility, they've got the performance, they've got what every company wants. My sense is that the answer is probably that there are so many reasons that people change organizations. So yeah, stars have those external opportunities working for them. They also benefit from all the social capital and status that they experience where they are right now, right? So there's sort of pulls in both directions. We know people leave when things aren't working out, when it doesn't feel like a fit. We know that people leave for lots of personal reasons. So I think that sort of is what leads to that lack of a statistically significant anyway finding between that sort of star status and job hopping classification.
Yeah, well, I know you had a sports reference in there somewhere in that episode, and it made me think we always talk about free agency and hiring. And so when free agency happened in sports, and a player could just go, right? They can just enter the market, see what their value is, and then they can demand a trade, and they can go. That's kind of where hiring, I think, took a kind of a turn. And this is years ago, but it's still there today. And I think even more so today. A star employee has power. Like it's kind of like a star wide receiver. We're going through it now in Philadelphia, right? We have A.J. Brown, star wide receiver. He wants to go. He'll go. He'll go anywhere he wants because he's that level of player. The Eagles really don't have a say. They do have a say. They don't have to trade him, but he'll just ruin the locker room, right? He'll make the other people unhappy. People aren't going to want to play with him. But when he does really well, it's probably because the other, 11 men on the field did well to allow him to do well, right? And I just think that's a fascinating conversation. So, okay, we talked about this briefly in passing in pre-show, but I wanted to talk about it here. Onboarding. What does this mean for onboarding? Is it a different process to onboard someone that you know is coming in as a job hopper, for example, versus someone who has been at their previous company for 9 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity for managers to be much more thoughtful about targeted or customized onboarding plans based on what employees need, right? So job hoppers probably need less support. It doesn't mean they don't need support, but they probably need less support than somebody who's been at the same organization for 15 years. Now, this is, I think, an important consideration here is in some of my other research looking at onboarding and socialization, I've heard in interviews from more experienced employees that when they've gotten hired into an organization, managers assume that they know what they're doing and they kind of leave them on their own. But experience isn't all the same, right? So if we've got people with 20 years of experience, two new hires with 20 years of experience, and one's moved around to many different organizations, and the other has spent their career in one organization for 20 years, they're going to need more support. They're going to need a better understanding of what's different here than where I was. How do I parse out the job skills that I'm bringing that are probably still relevant and that broader understanding of norms and culture and context that's going to be different here, right? And so really understanding, not just by counting years of experience, right? Not just by counting jobs, but really understanding individual new hires' needs, I think our study highlights as really critically important.
Yeah, it's really interesting how, when you say that, I'm thinking, well, it's kind of logic, right? Like I would think, at least if you're in the business, right, and you're in the field of HR and hiring, not every hiring manager, they're not professional hiring managers, right? They hire once, maybe twice a year. Some will do it a couple dozen times, but that's they're not professional at that. That's not their job. And so they expect someone to come in with 20 years, like you said, at one organization. They're good. They know what they're doing. They just need to come in and kind of get into the flow. But logic, for me anyway, is in reverse of that, where it's this person understands. They change, they can adapt, they're agile, all the above. Okay, so what have you learned during this research? What did you learn that was kind of that you weren't expecting to learn, that kind of made you like, this is really interesting. Not what we wanted, not what we expected, but something we needed to share with the public.
So I think we expected to find this. We had some sense of this possible job hopping advantage, and sometimes people ask, like, where do your research questions come from? What gets you interested in research? And some of this was just from personal conversations with colleagues who have moved around across universities, right? Other professors, and when I changed institutions about 6 years ago, and I had a colleague who had moved around quite a bit, and they had said something like, oh, you lose a year. You always lose a year in your research when you move institutions because you're coming up to speed and everything. And what stuck with me wasn't the, oh, you lose a year. It was that colleague knew that because they'd been through it so many times. And I thought, well, I've never moved other than joining from my first institution. I wouldn't have known that. You picked this idea up along the way, right? So that's kind of where the drive for this particular study came from. I think what was interesting to us was the magnitude of the difference, but also beyond that, coming up to speed more quickly. When we compared just the initial performance, we also saw that job hoppers saw less of an even initial drop in performance when they changed jobs. So it's not just coming up to speed. It's also just I experienced less shock when I'm coming into a new company. And that makes sense, but it just wasn't necessarily something that we set out with in mind ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were doing this research and you realized, yeah, I haven't moved. I don't have that experience. Did you question your research at that point? Like, wait a minute, I'm the storyline here. What's going on?
Sometimes it's hard to not reflect and say, what does this mean for me? What does this say about me? Yeah.
Is research really just soul searching and you're trying
Right.
to figure out your own life? Yeah. The research I think is fascinating, and it's how it gets distributed today. I think matters a lot. I know you obviously didn't study this part, but I think it really matters on how it gets distributed, because I don't know that people are reading 80-page white papers anymore. Right?
I know they're not.
Yeah. I don't know that I ever have, actually. I mean, maybe I have. But we consume things so quickly, right? And in short burst and short form, and it's kind of, I think that's also how we work. I really believe that's how we work. It's you're in, you're out, and that's not a bad thing. How do we? And I know you don't have this answer, but you've done the research. How do we begin for organizations or enterprises that aren't open to this, that are still stuck in the way of, they need to have tenure, they need to have been there, we don't want to see job hoppers? How do we start to break into this conversation? Because is this year, but I also think going in the next year to year after that, this is going to be critical for hiring, especially for companies that need very hard to find skill sets. And I think this is a direct hit on that if they're not open to it.
It's easy for me to give this answer because I'm a researcher. It's what I do.
Yeah.
But I think a data-driven answer is always, or a data-first answer is always helpful. So if you can get an organization to look at their own recent hires over the last 5 years and look back at their employment histories, right? Look back at your last 5 years of new hires. Are the people who had moved around, right? Are they worse off than the people that didn't? Right. Did they show some advantages? Did they come up to speed more quickly? So have them I would push organizations to look internally and actually question, are these assumptions that we've been hanging on to actually valid? Do they actually play out? Or would we surprise ourselves and see that maybe we should be more open to people who've moved around?
Yeah, well, then the question is, how do you measure their success and their performance and their impact, and as they're going through that? And unfortunately, a lot of companies are still stuck in the old performance review which is extremely biased, and at least in my opinion, extremely biased, and doesn't, it is not going to help them very much in this process. However, yes, I agree. I think that's a great way to do that. Becca, this has been amazing. I appreciate the time that you've given us. The research is amazing. So we'll have that linked somewhere in the show notes for y'all to grab it. But where can people find you and all of your research if they are interested?
So online, I'm I'm on the ILR website at on the Cornell University website, and I guess everywhere else that I publish. Yeah.
The research is there somewhere. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. Becca, thank you so much for your time. And until next time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and until next time.